You're listening to Conversations in Atlantic Theory, a podcast dedicated to books and ideas generated from and about the Atlantic world. In collaboration with the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, these conversations explore the cultural, political, and philosophical traditions of the Atlantic world, ranging from European critical theory to the Black Atlantic to sites of indigenous resistance and self-articulation, as well as the complex geography of thinking between traditions, inside traditions, and from positions of insurgency, critique, and counter-narrative. Today's discussion is with Dr. Michael Lawrence Dickinson, an assistant professor of African American history at Virginia Commonwealth University. He was a 2019 to 2020 Barra Sabbatical Fellow at University of Pennsylvania's McNeil Center for Early American Studies. His research interests include enslaved Black life, comparative slavery, Black Atlantic studies, and urban history. In this conversation, we discuss his book Almost Dead, Slavery and Social Rebirth in the Black Urban Atlantic, which was published in 2022 by the University of Georgia Press as part of its Race and the Atlantic World series. Our conversation here focuses on the key concepts and arguments in the book, where he argues how the Black urban Atlantic remains spaces for Black oppression and resilience. All right, so we're here today with Michael Lawrence. Welcome to the show. And as a way of getting started, we usually ask people who join what the origins of your project are, and if you can sort of narrate us through your project and how you came to it. John always talks about writing a book takes an emotional toll, philosophical toll, ethical toll. So what drew you to the questions in Almost Dead? Why this project and why now?
Sure. So that's a long story. And I think to start with, it might help to know a little bit about me. So I'm actually from Northern Delaware, which is in many ways just a sort of a large suburb of Philadelphia. And so I've always been fascinated by cities. Philadelphia in particular. My family would go to church on Sundays right outside of the city. That's where my parents met, and so I've always had this fascination with cities. And again, particularly Philadelphia. And so the project started out when I was a graduate student, and really I was intrigued and fascinated when I found out that many of the enslaved individuals who labored in Philadelphia, they actually came from the Caribbean. And so, in really thinking about that network, I was curious, and then I was whittling away at an archive with a dissertation fellowship in Philadelphia at the library company, and elsewhere. I was doing some research, and I eventually stumbled upon Jeffrey Brace's narrative, and so reading his narrative, it started to take more of a human turn, a human perspective. Not necessarily thinking only about the network of this Black Atlantic with port cities, but also more importantly thinking about these human stories that are part of that, right? The perspectives of enslaved individuals. And around the same time, I became familiar with Florence Hall's narrative. So an archivist at the library company, Crystal Appia. So shout out to Crystal. She brought it to my attention. She's at UVA now. And so that's a happy plug for our archivists out there that do wonderful work and make our work um, so much more possible. And so Crystal brought Florence Hall's narrative to my attention around the same time, and her narrative is famous in the Philadelphia area. I was stumbled upon at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania some years back, just within the papers of a slaveholder, and so this larger urban Atlantic started to take a more human perspective through these narratives in my mind, and that's really the story I started to want to tell. Right? How did enslaved individuals survive the Black urban Atlantic, and how did they envision these pathways in terms of their life experiences? And that's really the heart of the project. Really thinking about that larger question about survival and this urban Atlantic through the eyes of the enslaved.
And I really like how, you bring in, talk about Jeffrey Brace and Florence Hall, which you started off with Jeffrey Brace, and it's in such a storytelling mode that I kind of forget, oh, actually, this is real. Like, this is like he sifted through documents and then to put these stories together. So, how was it having to voice, these stories? And I don't know if I want to say that you were the voice, but you really did a great job, because I felt like I was reading something Jeffrey Brace would write,
Mm.
and of course you did put in quotations of exact things that they've said. But how was that for you? Did you face any challenges in terms of how to like frame this, because you really put it through the novel, like, sorry, not the novel, but the see I still think it's like a novel, but you put it through that you wanted their voices to shine through, the study.
Yes, I'm glad you picked up on that, and that's wonderful to hear. Just because I mean that was part of my goal here. I wouldn't say that. I know I think my writing pales in comparison to the actual testimonies of these enslaved individuals. They're so much more powerful than I can ever communicate. But trying to weave those stories into a larger narrative, that was something at the forefront of my mind when I wrote the book. Because because I wanted to draw the reader into this world, right? To help us to understand the lived realities of the daily struggles, the lived realities of survival, right? And social and otherwise for these enslaved individuals. And so to do that required a lot of effort. I mean, so it required in some cases prioritizing the narrative and flow to historiography, for instance, and jargon. You'll see in the footnotes that there's more historiography in the footnotes. There's that's added there, but it was sometimes they require prioritizing that, and we'll see how the reviewers what the reviewers think of that. But that was one of my goals. I wanted it to be readable for and help us to draw into those that larger world, because otherwise it's really difficult, right? We feel so removed in terms of time, but also in terms of experience in many ways. And so I wanted the reader to really appreciate that and be able to grapple with that. And the other part I will say, I wanted this to be readable for a larger audience outside of just academic historians or traditional historians. Um, because I think it's a larger story worth telling. So I wanted my dad, for instance. I actually made a post about this on Twitter the other day, because so my dad, he's brilliant, but he doesn't have a lot of formal education, right? He entered the Vietnam War almost directly out of high school, and so but he's also brilliant, and I wanted him to be able to grapple with these the arguments and the ideas um, and the content. And so he called me up over the weekend. We talk regularly, but he called me up just to tell me that he just finished reading the book cover to cover, and he provided his analysis. And so and so that's I think that's that if that's a metric of success, which I think in part it is for me, I will say mission accomplished. I also he got a kick out of me using my middle name on the cover because his first name is Lawrence, so I'm named after.
So in his head, he's like, I did something too. This is my work too. I
Right,
really
right.
like this wave of scholars who are putting out, studies like these,
Hmm.
not for just academia. They're like, this is really for everybody, and including everybody into the conversation. So
Right.
I like hearing the story that your dad is like, I have something to say too.
Yeah. And I think you make a useful point, right? I think it's a larger thrust of scholarship of newer works that are really trying to help us to understand elements of history and slavery in particular in ways that are, I think, evocative and digestible, and not limited to a traditional academic audience.
Hmm. And, I think one of the things your book does, which captured me, I mean, the name, that has to capture anybody, whether you are a historian or you only read comic books. I mean, just seeing Almost Dead, it's like, wait, what? So, can you tell us a little bit about how you came across, titling your book Almost Dead?
Right. So I will say I've always been very much enamored by quotes, and that can go any number of ways, right? Music, television, right? Um, uh, and movies, right? Any number of things, and books, memoirs, right? And so reading some of these testimonies, and they're just things that stand out, right? Not only in terms of its power, but also in so much that they're some of these quotes, including "Almost Dead," I think it speaks to a larger experience, right? Powerful, but also I think they're windows into a larger discussion. In reading Jeffrey Brace's narrative, that's something that stood out to me. It was just such a powerful statement. I'm almost dead, right? And there's so much there, and so that really resonated with me. And immediately I knew that there was something with that quote, and I just wanted to do something with it. And so as the project evolved, um, it started out as a chapter title, actually, and as the project evolved, I started to think about this quote more deeply, especially dealing with the theoretical framework. It was extraordinarily rich in its perspective, and I think that that's not only in terms of being eye catching, but also having um, a lot of meat to a fairly short statement.
Yeah, it definitely did, and I see how you followed that trajectory in the way you know, title your chapters. I have
Yes.
to say, chapter one is titled "I Courted Death." Chapter two, "A New Master Confused My Mind." I'm not going to read the rest so that everyone has something to look forward to. But you know, like chapter two, a name like "A New Master Confused My Mind." That was quite captive. Can you tell us more about like how that one came about? Because I'm super curious. Um, how did you know that okay, this was gonna be it for chapter two?
So, I I don't know that I did immediately. I knew it was a quote that I really enjoyed. It was between that quote and another quote from Jeffrey Brace that has somewhat of a similar sentiment when he's being held in a slave pen in Bridgetown. But I wanted to provide this larger perspective, this gender perspective, right? It's from Florence Hall. She's an enslaved woman, and I wanted to make sure that her voice was prioritized as well. But also, I mean, it was in part, this is something that I've sort of meditated on, thought about, right? Let marinate in my mind, because it wasn't just the quote, right? She says, "A new master confused my mind," but if you look at the actual document, there's the word another there that's crossed out. And so part of what I sort of try to grapple with in the chapter is um, whether it's just a typo, or whether this is her highlighting, right, that she constantly has these new masters, right? These new slaveholders that have possession over her, in a fairly short period of time, right? And that's part of the urban Atlantic story, switching hands between being sold from in West Africa, being sold when arrival in America, is being sold potentially multiple times after that. And so it's not just a new master; it's another new master, right? And so I think it really speaks to the larger um, this larger disorientation and social isolation that Florence Hall experiences and suffers, as well as um, individuals regularly in the urban Atlantic suffer. And so I think it's a window into a larger experience, more than the simple quote just allows. So that's part of why I chose that. I wanted a window into a larger conversation.
Hmm. And it's, you know, speaking of this whole window, you're building the book on social death and social rebirth.
Sure.
And you know, you talk about how, of course, you're standing on giants and you're like, I'm going to add something to this. So, can you speak how do you expand this framework on social rebirth and social death? I do know, you know, you give a nice definition for by the historian Orlando Patterson, excuse me. So, what do you think you're adding into this framework?
Sure. So really thinking about Orlando Patterson, right? He starts or creates this concept of social death to really help us to understand what it meant to be enslaved for these West Africans from a West African perspective or West African worldview. And he's referring to this denial of social personhood outside of a master slave relationship. And so he's trying to help us understand the trauma and the cultural trauma and social trauma of slavery that's part and parcel to the system of slavery, right? And so he creates this idea of social death, this term that is trying to encapsulate that. And so that's been critiqued or questioned or added to, let's say, probed by a number of scholars. John Wood Sweet is one of them. And But there's also we can think about Vincent Brown's work. But I think for me, what resonated most was the work of Stephanie Smallwood, and so Smallwood really tries to grapple with this idea of social death, and she sees it as incomplete in many ways, as only part of the conversation. And she uses this term social rebirth to highlight the ways in which African descendant peoples are working to rebuild and reconstitute and create new social ties. And so really what she takes issue with, and I think is what I try to build upon, is the permanency of social death, and instead see it as something that threatens and something that helps us understand the trauma of slavery, but not allowing it to minimize or limit or obscure the resilience of African descended peoples in reshaping and rebuilding. And so she takes this conversation thinking about the Middle Passage, and I work to take it beyond that,
Mm-hmm.
to the Americas, particularly within these port cities, and help us understand how they are rebuilding and reconstituting their cultural and social ties. How are they how are they not necessarily starting over, but working to survive, right? Because they're taking the memories and those connections with them of lost loved ones and a lost homeland, but they're also building within that and on top of that, in ways that are extraordinarily important and meaningful. Because I think what Orlando Patterson really, death. His social death theory really gives us is more of a top-down perspective, from this larger, hegemonic social construct. But what Stephanie Smallwood and myself, I would argue, are looking at sort of this bottom-up perspective through the eyes of those enslaved, meaning that doesn't take away from the trauma or the oppression, but it also helps us to understand a more fuller human story. And so I would argue it's not either or, it's both and. There's value in what Orlando Patterson was doing and saying, but there's also, I think, um, room to think beyond that as well, as a tool for understanding trauma, but also helps us to understand resilience through social rebirth.
And I think that's one of the things that made reading this so enjoyable because it didn't, of course, we're talking about trauma and pain and suffering, but then you still manage to weave in lines of, the hope that they had to keep alive in remembering their memories and connections to the homeland, or trying to forge connections like kinship and trying to keep those moments alive as a way of, persevering forward. And also something that was new for me was how you challenge this traditional portrait of urban Atlantic port cities being, hubs of Black freedom. You specifically
Yeah.
speak about Philadelphia, and you expand that to say, well, there's also Black bondage. There's these stories. So, can you speak more on what makes you want to speak about the flip side, of course, and what else, or I guess not what else, but do you think this work also speaks to or is a response to, this conversation around the erasure of the Middle Passage?
Sure. So I'll answer your first
That was a
question.
loaded question, so
Yeah.
take
No,
your time.
no, I'll answer the first question first and then move on to the middle passage, because I mean, I think if a general theme of my book, and I think of human of the of slavery, and I think just the human condition, right, also is um, it's oftentimes not either or, but both and so that's really funnels into really um, thinking about Philadelphia, right? It's very true that Philadelphia, I think, in many ways deserves its moniker, or or its reputation as a hub of Black liberty. Right, it's the first state to enact an abolition law in the U.S. It's home to the first abolition society, right, in the country. It has the largest free Black population in the nation by the end of the 18th century, turn of the 19th century. And so, for all these reasons, right, it should be seen as a hub of Black liberty. But what I also want to highlight here is that it's also a hub of Black bondage, right? And so in many ways, those two things can and do function side by side within Philadelphia. And so we think of this moniker, Philadelphia, as a hub of Black liberty, certainly, but also there is Black bondage. And in the eyes of these enslaved individuals, beginning in the 1680s and into the post-revolutionary era, right, that in many ways their enslavement, it would be difficult conversation to highlight to them and say, this is, you live in a hub of Black liberty. Well, much of what they suffer and much of what they deal with, right, is akin to that of enslaved individuals in urban centers in the Caribbean, for instance, right? And so there's a lot of there are a lot of variables there, right? Depends on who their slaveholder is. It depends on their circumstances, right? But it runs the gambit. And so I want us to it's a deliberate effort to push back against an overly simplistic narrative of Philadelphia as simply a hub of Black liberty, but really we need to highlight oppression as well in various forms, including slavery that reigned there, and thinking about the city as built upon, in many ways, the backs of enslaved labor, just like many other cities throughout the Atlantic. And so I want us to not lose sight of the complexity there, and that's part of what I'm trying to do with the project. Now, to answer your second question about the eraser in the Middle Passage, I think it's also helpful for us to think about the complexity of the Middle Passage in many ways, right? Because historians oftentimes, I think about the Middle Passage in terms of numbers and demographics. But I think what's lost in there is Black trauma, right? Black fear, Black suffering, right? That is part and parcel to the Middle Passage, both collectively and individually, right? And so that's part of the picture I want to highlight, or I tried to highlight, particularly in my first chapter, is help us to understand through the eyes of these enslaved individuals what is lost, what are they bringing in terms of trauma to the Americas, right? How are they experiencing these seismic shifts in their social realities that are extraordinarily influential in their life experiences, but also how are they surviving, right? Emotionally, right, psychologically, as well as physically. And so really what I want us to think about and really appreciate is this spectrum of human emotion that they're experiencing on the Middle Passage, beyond merely the numbers and sort of just the facts, but on a human level, right? What does that look like?
So, I guess another question, when you're digging through this and looking at all these different facets, how are you coping? Because this is not an easy project. And I also have to say, you mentioned at the beginning how you were, in the introductory pages, you had to scramble a little bit because it was COVID and
Yeah,
libraries were closing, and you're dealing with, a project that's not exactly sunshine and rainbows.
certainly.
So how is that for you?
So I think the COVID hiccup, let's call it that. I think it's a small, a nice way of putting it. The project was impacted by COVID, necessarily so, right? So I was fortunate that I conducted a lot of the research before the pandemic struck, but I think the larger issue was that I couldn't go back to look up anything, so I couldn't like flesh out anything that I wanted because I couldn't go back into the archives to look at material more deeply, or look at other sources. Um, and you'll see in my acknowledgments, I actually give praise to a number of folks. It ranged from colleagues to graduate students to I was on a fellowship at University of Pennsylvania at the time. That they were very helpful in trying to get me access to things that I couldn't otherwise. Right. So McNeil Center was very kind in procuring me any number of books that I needed because I couldn't get into libraries, right? Um, and so that I think this is a larger I don't know, a larger experiment, I think, in not only in terms of pivoting and being versatile, but also in terms of the help of friends and colleagues, and that were extraordinarily um, generous in their help at sort of a difficult time for someone to be writing a book. But I will say it also forced me to look more deeply at the sources that I had, right? Um, so so in many ways, I think the book would have looked different if I had more if I had regular access to the archives and libraries that I would have liked. But I will say it forced me again to look more deeply at what I had and really inhabit the space more deeply, and help us and ask sort of probing questions that perhaps I wouldn't have asked before if I didn't if I had more access to materials. And so I think the book would look different. But I do think that that the finished product was help. I think it helps us to really think more deeply about testimonies of enslaved individuals. Helps us really think about the questions that or perspectives that um, we can answer, but I think we can use complementary sources to really try to augment that and supplement that and help us to have a larger picture that hopefully in the next round of historians like yourself will pick up in the mantle and be able to dig more deeply and flesh out those
Mhm.
things in archives.
Yeah, I guess the thing with these archives is that it's already fragmented,
Right.
and then when you're placed in a pandemic and it's like you're further, it's like you're in a further little box. You're like, why? So it's just it's a fascinating time to do research. Let's say that.
Yes,
And
definitely.
when you were, I guess, in the archive, did you face, well, sure you did, but what were they, or what was a challenge that was a little bit more like when it came to this project and looking through the testimony or even finding testimonies,
Yeah.
that could really speak to this project?
Right. And I just realized I forgot to answer your second question in the last
It's,
round.
I mean, it's an emotional one. I saw that you dodged it. I'm like, I'll bring it around. It's okay.
Well, I'll start with that question and move into the archival issue of archival silences. I mean, so I think you're right that much of this material is weighty, it's heavy, right? And so I think researchers, historians, scholars need to take that with care for ourselves, right? Realizing that there is emotional weight to reading some of these accounts, and many of these accounts of slavery. But I will say, I mean, I will say that, especially being, an African American man, right? That being perfect people of African descent, it's sort of that oppression, that trauma, right? That we're forced to deal with regularly, right? And on a regular basis, and so even without those testimonies, and even without reading about the trauma, right? I think there's a necessary resilience that I know I've cultivated. I'm sure many others have cultivated in life, necessarily so again for people of African descent, and people of color more generally. And so all those things are true, right? Making sure that there is space to walk away, right? Sometimes when some of these things become too weighty, but also um, realizing that there's a level of personal investment and a level of personal resilience, right? That it takes in terms of writing these stories
Especially
and
if you're,
analyzing.
reading about the resilience of Jeffrey
Right,
Rice.
right.
It's hard to just be like to kind of give up on that narrative because of how resilient he was in pursuing and being determined to
Hmm.
continue to like be, almost dead. He's like,
Right,
so
right.
it's that's yeah, it was really touching to read.
And I think that's an excellent point, right? Because I mean, as I read his narrative and I read that of Florence Hall and a number of these testimonies and accounts, the least I can do, right, is read about them, given that they lived through it, right? And so the least I can do is try to really read through those stories, write about those stories, popularize those stories, help us understand those stories, right? That's the least I can do, given that they lived through all of this, and I think that's helpful for us to keep in perspective. And I think that that also talks about, or that speaks to teaching as well, right? In terms of our some trepidations we might have about teaching some of these stories, right? I mean, again, the least we can do is learn about them rather than try to just ignore them or act like they aren't out there. I know for my students, I want them to be moved by these testimonies and narratives. I think that's part of the goal here is not to shield from that, but instead to embrace that, grapple with it, and help us to understand how we can fight to make sure it doesn't happen again, right? And so so that's an excellent point you made.
And I just to speak to this resiliency, and the least we can do is read about it. But also, what I enjoyed in the book is you brought out how they went through it. So
Mm,
it's not that they were just resilient, but it's just like, well, this is how they went through it, and this is maybe how we can adapt and learn from people who had to go through these painful and terrible experiences, as a way of saying there is a little bit of hope, no matter
right.
how bad and just, just terrible it can be. um so yeah, there was like this, it was dark, but like
Yeah.
there was like sunshine at the end. And I mean, that's how you ended the book, so it showed through.
Well, thank you. And so that's, I think that's again the spectrum of human emotion, right? Because I think this is especially important also because when we think about oppression, right, it rarely just disappears entirely. More oftentimes just changes form, right? And so what I wanted to highlight here is that it's I didn't want to paint a rosy picture of just resilience of African descendant peoples, though that's part of the story, right? I actually had a question about this when I was giving a talk on the book maybe a couple of weeks ago, and it was about the resilience of African descendant peoples. And what I want to highlight here is not something necessarily endemic about being a perfect person of African descent that they can just deal with more, right? Or that they're naturally just more resilient than their white counterparts. No, I think it speaks to this human need to survive, right? This human need to endure despite all of those things. So we can take all of the fear, anxiety, alienation, right, loneliness, all those things that come with slavery, and also highlight the ways in which people of African descent um, they endured, right? Not necessarily because they didn't feel those things, but in spite of the fact that they felt those things, right? And so I think you're right in that it tells us also a human story about this level of resilience of that human beings can demonstrate amid oppression, that should provide I think a message of encouragement to all of us in present day that there can be a level of endurance for each of us, despite the continued reality of systemic oppression, and that's no secret to people of African descent in the present. So, so I'm preaching the choir there, but I think it's helpful for us to really look back to look forward.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. So back to the question, I need to stop asking you like four questions at the same
I'm
time.
sorry.
But no, that's completely fine. Because when I was reading, it was just, yeah, I had questions. But so I did wonder, when you had to piece through the archive, the time that you did have,
Right.
to find the source material. How was that experience, and what challenges did you face? Was it like you just the testimonies and incomplete? It's always interesting to hear the time people spend in their experience and trying to like unsurface these testimonies and these stories.
Right. I mean, I think you're right that a lot of this is incomplete. I mean, that's generally the story scholars who write on slavery, right? I mean, it makes the stories that are somewhat complete all the more rewarding, right? But I think it's also, I mean, really thinking about these archival silences, or these larger gaps, right, that we can't tell parts of the story. But I think that there's, with all that said, right, I think there's enough to say meaningful things about many of these stories, and that requires a level of flexibility on the part of researchers as well, to be able to think sort of. Um, think more holistically about how to use complementary sources to tell a larger story. I think one example of this is my chapter on the gatherings of enslaved individuals in cities on holidays and Sundays throughout the Anglo-Atlantic, and there aren't a lot of sources on that, at least for the Anglo-Atlantic. I know there are for the more so for Latin America, but in terms of the Anglo-Atlantic, there's not a lot about what they look like, right? We have some observer accounts, um, but I do think we have enough in terms of demographics, in terms of what things look like in among West African ethnic groups, right? Traditionally, and what things look like in terms of any number of other pieces of evidence and theoretical frameworks to really give some type of picture about what these things look like. I think the next step of that would also be to think about, anthropologists and musicians, and perhaps folks trained in traditional forms of West African dance, and really think about, how can we recreate that. But I think that we can piece together those things based off of supplementary evidence, not necessarily first all of the firsthand accounts. Right? They're helpful, but they're not complete. And so this requires, again, a level of creativity, a level of dynamic thinking on the part of researchers and historians. Um, because many of those, you're right, many of those accounts are incomplete, or they don't give the full picture. But I think we can get a human story out of it, and useful analysis from these bits and pieces of breadcrumbs, and in so much that we're able to recreate a world of the urban Atlantic through the eyes of enslaved individuals.
And one of these worlds that you create, or you at least you tell in the book, is I really enjoyed. You know, I don't know if I would call them love stories, but it was like a short glimpse into the lives of
Yeah.
a couple of these people, which I enjoyed, and it was in chapter 5. So you spoke about how enslaved blacks used communal connections to survive the emotional toll of bondage. So you speak on the stories of Lucy and Ishmael in Kingston, Anne and Frank in Philadelphia, and Andrew and Hester in Bridgetown, who pursued relationships with significant others, even though they weren't in the same space.
Right.
So, what did you think about these stories while you were writing, and what do you think these stories can tell us? How do they add to this further, framework when we talk about slavery and bondage? But now you're looking at it from like, well, they actually, and it kind of blows my mind. It's
Right.
like with all the pain and suffering, they still like kept those,
Right.
relationships. And I think that there's beauty in that.
Right.
How yeah. I wonder, coming across a document like that and like having to read these things, I would have been like, wow. And people today have all types of excuses. But I'm like, here we are. I was like, it was really inspiring.
Well, that's great to hear. I think that question really does follow up the last question very well. I mean, it's fascinating to me that that chapter resonated so much with you, because it was the most difficult to write, and most frustrating to write, if I'm being honest. In large part because, I mean, I only get glimmers of these individuals in the archives, right? And that's part of what I'm trying to highlight here, right? I wanted more about their relationships. I wanted more about what do we know about them, but there is the historical record doesn't provide much, right? And so, so it's it's a bit frustrating, right? Because I think you're right that these are powerful stories, but I want there to be more there. And so what I wanted to do though with those fragments is help us to understand in within those gaps, right? Within the fact that we can't understand or don't know the entire story, we we can point out what we do know, right? We do know about these connections that they're forging, that they're meaningful to them, right? And this is where we get into the complexity of being enslaved, right? That those linkages of love, that they matter, and that they're comforting, and that they're sources of hope, but they're also liabilities, right, for any number of reasons. That it's very real, the threat of forced separation in these urban settings. Although we don't think about it that way, oftentimes we think about it in terms of plantations, that there's these forced separations, but it happens. It happens regularly within these urban centers. So there's the threat of being separated forever. There's this the threat of the system of slavery ripping loved ones apart, right? And there's also this is part of the reason why I have a chapter on slave punishment, realizing that the individuals you mentioned, right? These couples that they actually run away together, and given everything we understand from the chapter on slave punishment, that the odds were against them, and also they risked so much, right? In terms of bodily injury, but also being sold away and separated permanently, right? If they run away together, and in some cases death, right? Because of running away, and so I wanted to highlight that we can understand that this was so important to them that they risked everything, but we need to also highlight what they risked. And for those who did not run away, right, that they have this constant anxiety and trepidation about being separated from loved ones that pervades their nights and days, even though they can have comfort and hope within their relationships. That doesn't take away from the constant threat of losing loved ones that very much mattered, right? And so I want to make sure that we don't have this sort of fairy tale image of these relationships as just being sources of comfort, but they're also liabilities emotionally, that they're setting themselves up in many ways for this heartache that the system of slavery continually dangles in front of them and threatens them with, right? And so and that is on top, of course, even those who come from West Africa who already have the heartache of loved ones. Again, memories that are sources of comfort and hope, but also sources of pain and anguish, right? So a lot of this has to do again with two things can be true at the same time, right? It's neither either or, but it's both and, that they can have hope and comfort, but they can also have anxiety and fear at the same time with these relationships.
And it's parallel to, your project in terms of, yes, Philadelphia is a hub of freedom, but at the same time,
Hmm.
it was also a hub of, trauma and pain and
Right.
suffering. So yeah, there's a lot of, like you said, both ands
Right.
in this project that really, challenges traditional framework and speaks to the complexities of, just so many of these stories. So I'm liking this multi-layer. Now, this other thing that, I mean, I know you were surprised, and I when you speak about it in the book, because I was surprised. I was like, you actually did this. But towards the end of the book, you speak about the legacies of captive social rebirth and the continued like resiliency of African descended people in these urban Atlantic settings. So you also ended up finding the descendants of Jeffrey Brace and contacting them in 2019. Um, can you tell us about like who these descendants are, how that conversation went? Because I mean, wow, that's like you followed through like generations later, and still bringing the story to light.
Right. So, Miss Shauna, and Miss Rhonda were extraordinarily helpful.
Mm-hmm.
They started to come more in the spotlight around when I was writing the book, or maybe a few years before when I first found the narrative, because the Jeffrey Bace's narrative was republished, and there were efforts to really reconcile with this legacy of oppression, racial oppression in Vermont, and so there's actually a marker, historical marker, where Jeffrey Brace lived now, and there's also a scholarship at the local university for a social justice scholarship, and so the family they recently were made aware of the narrative by historian Carrie Winter, who wrote the foreword or the introduction to the re-release of the narrative. And so I was sort of I had let's say reservations, or I had reserved optimism when I actually contacted them and asked them
Mm-hmm.
to chat about the narrative and how they're really experiencing these things, because I wanted to have their voice and really
Mm-hmm.
help us to think about this um, in present day. And so they were extraordinarily helpful. They were wonderful to speak with and extraordinarily generous with their time, and really thinking about their how proud they were of their ancestor. That was one of the themes that came out. They were extraordinarily excited to speak about this narrative and really think about what it means to their family and and to them individually. And so those are some of the threads from those conversations I worked to pull out in the epilogue, because I think part of this is again personally based for me,
Mm-hmm.
because I mean, as a black man, I don't have those connections, right? I don't have written records from my ancestor in
Mm-hmm.
those ways. And so this it was wonderful to see their reactions, hear their reactions when thinking about their ancestors' narratives, his words, his perspective, right? Because I think people of African descent throughout the diaspora long for that,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a larger conversation about, well, how do we think about this connection to the past, these
Mm-hmm.
connection to these testimonies, not only in terms of connecting to a family, but also connecting to people of African descent more broadly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And allowing that connection to the past, understand, where we've come from, the suffering that our ancestors endured, the ways in which oppression still lingers, as well
Mm-hmm.
as those. The need for that continued resilience in a world where there is continued systemic oppression. And so all those questions sort of spun around within my discussions with them, and so they were really helpful in thinking about how these narratives are meaningful to the present, and help us to really think about the ways things have changed, but also how they've stayed the same, right? How there are
Mm-hmm.
continuities from the history in history to the present, and really thinking about how do we deal with the afterlives of slavery
Mm-hmm.
in ways that are far less remote. And if we go back to the beginning of our discussion, part of what I wanted to do is help us to not see these things as remote, or
Mm-hmm.
so far in the past that um, they are they are not as they don't resonate as much. But instead, I want us to highlight, right, that this isn't as far away as we think, nor is
Mm-hmm.
the in terms of the temporal boundaries, the time periods, but also it's not as far away as we think in terms of the impact of much of this trauma, and the continued need for resilience in the present.
Mm-hmm. And it's I really like how you mentioned, because we don't know too much about, Brace's wife, this was a way to incorporate like two black women into the story.
Definitely.
So what did you expect to do that, when you were writing this project, or was this something that happened towards the end and you were like, well, I mean, they responded, so this is a great way to wrap up the book?
So I think I enter with the interviews with the idea of just taking these thoughts for what they were, not sort of just having a clear-eyed, conversation, and sort of going with where that took me, right? About what they wanted to discuss and how they really wanted to think through how what their thoughts were in terms of Black history, in terms of the narrative, in terms of any number of things. And so I wanted to include that in the book in some fashion. Um, I didn't yet know where that would lead, or what I really wanted to do with that. I just sort of wanted to let their stories tell themselves, and let that propel where it fit in with the book. And so as I wrote, and as I really reflected on their comments, and their really insightful observations, it seemed as though that it became sort of a logical placing for those interviews at the in the epilogue, to help us to think about connecting this to the present, because this is something that I really try to do within my teaching as well, right? Not just thinking about history as something in the past, but history as something that influences the present in very real ways, that we tend to not think about, or tend in some case be want to be willfully ignorant of. And so I
That's a
wanted to
very
make
nice way of putting it. Willfully ignorant. I see what you did there.
yeah, so that's really something, and that sort of fit organically as I started to really think about our discussions and reflect on their insights. And so I'm glad I was able to end, as you mentioned, with these two black women, given that as we know, there aren't as many testimonies from Black women, right, in terms of the archive, or in terms of primary sources, and so really making these connections with Black women for the epilogue, I think, was really important for the book, but I think important uh, for the reader to really think not only in terms of Jeffrey Brace's story, but also really think about how this is impacting his descendants, who the two I spoke with were black women. I think it's meaningful.
Yeah. It was a surprise for me because I was like, oh well, the story continues on, which is the whole point. It
Dun
doesn't
dun dun.
exactly. It just didn't end, and I was just like, yeah, I like the continuity of it. So it was definitely a nice touch to the book.
Thank you.
So, you asked this question, and I'm assuming when you were writing this book, you had like this fantastic fantasy of this reader reading your book. And did you have any idea of what this reader would look like or what they would take away from it? We speak a little bit to it in terms of not for it to not just be within academia, but for it to be, anybody should be able to like pick up this book because you make it so digestible. But what are some of the things you would want a reader to walk away from, when they put down your book?
Yeah, so I don't know that I wrote this with anyone outside of my parents in mind, and my loved ones in mind, as well as we all need the book, as in academia we want the book for tenure, right? The For professional things, right? That matters as well. But beyond that, I don't know that I envisioned an ideal reader here, and I think that speaks to. I mean, it's I'm still surprised when the book actually comes out on bookshelves on May 1st, but I have folks that have contacted me and told me like they read it, and I'm thinking I didn't expect them to read, right? Which is a good thing, right? But I will say I want my reader, or the readers more broadly, to take away seeing the full spectrum of human emotion for these enslaved individuals and populations, right? I think we often think of slavery in terms of labor, and in terms of demographics, but I want to highlight the human element here, right? That the complexity of being enslaved in these spaces, that it's not either or, once again, but both and I want them to see these individuals and populations as multivalent, multidimensional, right? To see them really as human beings, not just figures in necessarily in a book, or on a piece of paper, but I want them to really inhabit that space and that world, with all of its complexity and messiness and all of its pain and sorrow, but as well as its hope and comfort, right? And I want them to take all of that and help in order to understand what it meant to inhabit the space of the Black urban Atlantic. And so hopefully, if they walk away with that, with a sense of that humanity, I think I've done my job.
Yeah, and I think it helps, you know, give them a perspective that's a little bit more, empathetic to
Right,
seeing people as humans,
right, right.
which is a conversation that we continue to have today. So yeah, I'm glad this is out there and people that you are surprised to be reading it are reading it. That's a good thing. Let's hope they use it for intentionally in a way that's it breaks any ignorance Let's put it that way. Oh, there's so many things and words to like curve around when you're, speaking about this. So when guess the question for you after this is what's next, like where did this project leave you, and what do you plan on, are you going to plan on working on it more, developing it, or what's next for Michael Lawrence Dickinson? I put the Lawrence in there for your dad's.
Well, thank you. I'm sure he'll be be grateful for that. Um, well, I think this leaves me. I mean, there's still a number of things left on the table, right? I think one of the best things that one of my advisors, W. Maloba at University of Delaware, he always told me, right, you don't have to put everything in one project, right? And so there's a lot of things on the cutting room floor that sort of got lopped off just because it wasn't part of the story that I wanted to tell. It didn't fit in, and so there is that possibility. Um, but I very much see myself in the next project. I started doing some work on it. I was fascinated by this. Again, these human stories. I'm really thinking about, in this case, forced separation in the domestic slave trade, a little bit later, but and of course a different region. But I'm living here in Richmond, and I have a lot of students that have interests in what that looked like, right? Because we think of the domestic slave trade again in many ways in terms of numbers, and in terms of these networks, but there's not a huge amount of work outside of one or two books really thinking about forced separation and the human toll that takes. And I'm really interested again with rebuilding, reimagining, reconstituting amid the pain and the sadness and all those things that come with the constant threat of forced separation. And so, really thinking about how do these urban centers, Richmond, as well as other urban areas, function as spaces of forced separation and Black trauma. I think those are human stories that I want to look at more deeply, thinking about a second book project. And so, um, hopefully that this book has prepared me well for that.
And
Um,
hopefully you'll have more access to the archive, and it's not like a post-COVID,
that
part
is true.
two that's gonna take place. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, I really urge people to, pick up the book. And I really feel like if you're afraid of history and all that, historical jargon, you make it so digestible for just anybody to just read the book and understand like these are human stories with just human experiences, and how these people persevered through these times. And then seeing the continued legacies just makes it even more, it makes it more inspiration, especially during times where, there's a little hope, and things are like, well, is it going to be the same?
All
So,
right.
this book it was really good to be like, well, it's up and down, and that's okay. But, you're still alive and survive through it all. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much. It's very kind of you.